All right, welcome to part 2 of Foundational Principles of Sustainability for Environmental Studies 505. In this video, we're going to look at the tragedy of the commons, different worldviews and how those relate to environmental issues. We're going to focus on environmental systems as dynamic, they change over time, and we're going to look at a systems approach to ecology. How do we kind of consider all of the systems that are interacting with each other? Because that's going to be really important in managing environmental areas and environmental systems. Ultimately, we're also going to look at stakeholders. Who has a stake in what's going on in a particular environmental area? So think about the stakeholders, think about who they might be, and then for the case that we look at this week, we're not going to dig as much in detail as we will in subsequent weeks, but I want you to think about who are the potential stakeholders in that case. So the first concept, the tragedy of the commons, this is kind of a thought experiment that gets you to think about shared resources. And Garrett Hardin originally introduced this concept, and it was kind of illustrated as a shared field known as the commons. At this time, people would each have cows, and they would take them out to a common area in order to graze them. Nobody owned that land. It was equally shared by all. For example, 40 acres of shared resources might support 20 cows. So if you have a small village there, 10 households, and each of them has 1 or 2 cows, everything's going to be fine. The cows go out and graze the grass, but yet the grass grows quickly enough that it overcomes the grazing by the cattle and it's able to sustain itself. So this kind of gets back to our concept of maximum sustainable yield. So then what everybody wants to do is maximize their own personal increase, their own income. If you have 1 cow, you might have 2. Okay, and then this gets us up to our carrying capacity of 20 cows. It can support exactly 20 cows, no more, because if you have more than 20 cows, it's then they're going to eat the grass more quickly than the grass can grow back. But think about this, each farmer is going to act in their own self-interest. So if I have 2 cows for my family, if I add a 3rd cow, I'm increasing my income by 50%. I'm able to sell that much more milk. I'm able to raise that much more for beef production. I've increased it, so I get all the benefit from that. But who bears the cost? Well, that cost is then shared among all 10 village families that live there. I bear some of that cost, but only 1/10 of that cost because there are 9 other families that also have cows. And so it's going to get depleted, but I'm only bearing some of the cost, but I get all the benefit. And in doing so, what Garrett Hardin argued is that we're moving toward an area where people will abuse shared resources like the commons. Now, there are some other examples of this because this is not just cows and land. We might think of any shared resource. Nobody owns the fish of the sea, or the air that we breathe, or the groundwater. You know, this is equally shared among everybody and probably ought to be managed so it's harvested in a sustainable way. You might envision 3 people as shown in this cartoon where they dig down, they find an aquifer, and they extract the water from that. But in doing so, in the central United States, there's an aquifer called the Ogallala Aquifer. And the water that's being harvested from there probably was around during the Ice Age. And so this is basically kind of like fossil water that we are extracting from that area because there's some that's added each year, but the amount that's being extracted each year is much, much more than the amount of rainfall that percolates down into the groundwater. So any one person might believe, hey, I can take as much water as I want, but then that's going to have a negative impact on other people. Air pollution works the same way. Nobody owns the air, and for some companies it was cheaper to just emit air pollution and because the benefits then come to that company. They're saving money. and the costs are shared by everybody. Plus, the solution to pollution is dilution. So if you dilute that pollutant among all of the air, it'll only affect people a little bit, but it will have an effect. Deforestation of the Amazon. That's less oxygen that's then being produced for each of us. We share that because we share that resource. Water pollution. Again, water, any pollutant released in water is going to disperse itself in the water. And so each polluter benefits from an inexpensive way to dispose of their waste, but we all bear that cost on the average. So can you think of other examples of this? Now, what are some solutions to this? The first is private property. Taking our shared farmland before, like this video shows, or this screenshot from a video, and basically dividing it up into areas where each farmer has their own land. Now, that's their land. They bear the cost as well as reap the benefits. And so it's on each farmer then to deplete their own resource only a little bit, so that it will always be there to provide for themselves. So private property generally encourages people to take care of their own land because they bear the cost, but some people will then deplete their resource and then sell the farm after it's been eroded. In other cases, governmental regulations such as fishing quotas and emission standards can be seen as things that you can do where you regulate this so that it's fair for everybody. And fishing standards are a good example. This is a photo from a recent fishing trip. And this is a black sea bass fishery, a fishery that's really well managed off the coast of Virginia. You can only, at the current time, you can only catch and keep fish that are 13 inches or larger in order to allow them to definitely get up to spawning age. And you can only keep 15 per day. You can't just keep catching and catching and catching them. You have to throw any extras back, and you have to throw the small ones back so that hopefully they can grow up to be large enough to be harvested in the future. Likewise, emission standards, governmental regulations can basically help us by saying, here's the set limit, that you can only emit this much pollutant in order to protect human health. Or we're not going to tell you how to get to that point of how to limit your sulfur emissions, for example. Under the Clean Air Act, companies were told they had a set standard that they could not emit more than that standard, but it didn't tell the company how they would reach that standard. They could either install expensive scrubbers in order to take the sulfur dioxide out of the smokestack, or they could buy low sulfur coal and have it shipped in order to then emit less sulfur because there's less sulfur in the coal that they're burning. And finally, reserves. No-take zones are examples of solutions because it basically sets an area aside as a preserve that's then shared, but no one is going to extract from there. And then presumably it reaches a carrying capacity, and the excess production then spills over into adjacent areas. A good example of that is Apo Island Reserve in the Philippines. This was an area where people over-harvested the fish resource. They would have to go further and further from their home, and then they started relying on more destructive techniques of harvesting, like cyanide fishing, shown here on the left, or dynamite, which would then stun the fish. The fish would come up to the surface. As you can imagine, you can only do that so many times before you wreck the coral in the reef, and then you have nothing. And that's what they had. They basically wrecked their fish populations and wrecked their local reefs. Somebody in the area had heard about a nearby area, another island, that had set up a reserve, and this was very successful. A lot of fish regrew and repopulated within that reserve, and then the excess production then spilled over to the adjacent area where it could be harvested. And so that's what they implemented here, and they actually found that this was really successful. You didn't need a large reserve, and you could just put one person on the shoreline in order to police this particular area and make sure there was no unauthorized fishing. The excess fishing would then spill over into the other areas shown by fish on this diagram, where people could then capture the excess fish. From there, they then had to petition the Philippine government to only allow people of Apple Island to fish in the waters around their area, because they were voluntarily restricting their own harvest. And they also argued that you should have to not use destructive techniques anywhere around Apple Island. And the result was that the fish populations came back. It became much easier for them to harvest their fish, and the fish population was so large that this became then a snorkeling destination for ecotourists who wanted to see healthy reefs and healthy fish populations. So there was a financial benefit from that as well. The next concept I want to make sure that we have a good understanding of is worldviews. Now, worldviews in the environmental sense basically relate to what's the relationship between humans and nature. Are humans part of nature? Are they separated from nature? Are we part of the environment, but our actions are not natural? These are things that we want to consider. Are we part of nature, or have we separated ourselves from nature for one reason or another? And if we have separated, what obligation do we then have to care for the natural world and take care of species? And this boils down to worldviews that we'll call anthropocentric worldviews or biocentric worldviews, also known as ecocentric worldviews. So centric refers to kind of the center of the focus. Anthropology studies human society. So anthropocentric worldview focuses on humans and human societies. That's the focus of our perspective. Versus bios means life. And so a biocentric worldview focuses on living things, or an ecocentric worldview focuses on ecological connections between organisms and sees humans as an active part of the ecosystem. So an anthropocentric worldview, humans are not part of nature. Humans are above other organisms. We're the most important species on the planet. And anthropocentric people might look at environmental resources from a utilitarian perspective. How can we utilize it? How can I catch the fish in the ocean and utilize it in a sustainable way? Okay. In contrast, biocentric perspective sees that humans are part of nature. We're another organism in the system. We might have a bigger role, but we are fundamentally just like the other species in the ecosystem. And from a biocentric or ecocentric perspective, you might view things in terms of having intrinsic value. A species has value because it exists, because it's a unique species that's the byproduct of evolutionary forces that have led to the diversification and the proliferation of many species on our planet. That we shouldn't then cause any one species to go extinct, even if we can't assign a dollar value or a use to that particular species. Now, can you think of examples of these types of worldviews? Let me give you a couple. First of all, the frontier mentality. Imagine the colonists coming to North America. Probably there wasn't a whole lot of concern for the Native American tribes that were there. Certainly there wasn't a lot of concern for the animals that they came across, except these were deer that could be harvested, pigeons that could be shot, and bison that could be then slaughtered for their hide, for their meat, and ultimately for their bones. And so on the left-hand side, this shows a stack of bison skulls and people standing on top of that, just as kind of a graphic depiction of the frontier mentality. And the frontier mentality means kind of go west, young man. The world is yours to take over and conquer. And this really has its roots in the concept of manifest destiny, that we're destined to take over the world and remake it according to our own needs. As a result of this, the bison were over-harvested and they shrunk down. And the bones, for example, you might be asking yourself, what's the use of bones of a buffalo? These were actually brought back to the East Coast, ground up, and then used as fertilizer. You've heard of putting bone meal on your garden. That's basically what they were doing with this. This provided a large source of calcium and phosphorus for the plants that were growing in gardens and farmland in the East. And this then provided a source of resources, using every part of the bison until there are no more bison left, and they're restricted from the tan area to the brown area to these little isolated herds located in the black areas on the map to the right. So clearly, the previous example was an example of an anthropocentric worldview. A biocentric or ecocentric worldview was first really articulated by Aldo Leopold. Now, John Muir would have had a biocentric worldview, but this was first fully articulated that we have an ethical obligation to other species, was articulated by Aldo Leopold in his Sound County Almanac and Sketches Here and There, published shortly after his death in the 40s. He argued that all components of the environment are a part of a community of interacting parts, and all members of this community merit ethical consideration. Each species has an intrinsic value, even if there's not a dollar sign we can attach to it. He likewise argued in his essay, The Land Ethic, as a part of this book, the Sound County Almanac, he argued a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. So this is now assigning an ethical right and wrong based on the integrity of the biotic community, the stability, but also the beauty of the biotic community. That we should not do this to our ecosystems because it makes it ugly. Okay, he would argue that that is a scar on the landscape and that is not something that's right for us to be doing. He was thinking more of the ecological linkages among species and saw us extending our ethical considerations beyond just people, but to all the living things in an ecosystem. And he referred to this as the land ethic. We didn't really have the term ecosystem at that time in the 40s. It was not in widespread use. And so by the term the land, he meant the land, all the plants growing on it, and the ecological community that depends on those plants. Another case would be a stewardship ethic. St. Francis, preaching to the birds, kind of graphically depicts that St. Francis argued that we should be nurturers and caretakers of the natural world. He was seen preaching to the birds, either figuratively or literally, but certainly espoused that we ought to consider other species as a part of this. Now, you might ask the question, is this anthropocentric or biocentric? The answer would be it's a little bit in the middle. At heart, it's anthropocentric. Certainly, St. Francis still would have seen humans as the most important species on the planet, but yet saw that we had an ethical obligation to other organisms. That we ought to treat birds kindly, that we ought to not abuse an ecological system. And thus, the environmental worldviews of the planet, these are three different worldviews that vary from a gradient from anthropocentric to biocentric, but yet all are advocating for environmental conservation. From a planetary management standpoint, we're the most important species, but our own survival then depends on how well we manage the ecosystems of the world. And probably we're not going to run out of resources, we shouldn't waste them. On the other side, the environmental wisdom perspective sees us as just one species inhabiting the planet. We should encourage Earth-sustaining forms of economic growth, and our success depends on learning how nature sustains itself and following that model. Stewardship somewhere in the middle. We are the most important species on the planet, but we have an ethical responsibility to take care of nature. We probably won't run out of resources, but we shouldn't waste them. And we should encourage environmentally beneficial economic forms during our lifetime. So, If you were to argue to somebody that has an anthropocentric worldview, arguing, hey, each species of bug deserves to live, that might not be an argument that's successful with an anthropocentric person. You might have to say there are unknown species that exist in the tropical rainforest, and we might be losing out on an economically important resource or a new medicine that might help cure a form of cancer or something like that. That would be an argument that wins the day with an anthropocentric perspective, versus a biocentric person is not going to be as concerned with dollars and cents, but more our ethical obligation and our ethical responsibility. Now, some additional environmental concepts just to kind of put this in context. Environmental systems by their nature are dynamic. We tend to think of a carrying capacity, but really the amount of organisms in a population can fluctuate, and ecosystems and communities can change over time. So a couple of points to illustrate this. So for example, a population of song sparrows, there are factors that increase that population. Both new births and immigration from outside the area is going to add to the population in that area. If that area then becomes overpopulated, you might have some factors that decrease the population size. Increased predators that then cause death of some of these individuals, or the excess population might migrate out. And so the actual population is going to fluctuate over time. Even Daphnia, a little water flea in the laboratory, fed a sufficient amount of food, it's going to increase, ultimately overshoot its carrying capacity, but then kind of die back and settle around this area. We call this damped oscillation. The population numbers oscillate around the carrying capacity, but they might overshoot it and then die back. If you're below the carrying capacity, ecosystems tend to want to increase the abundance of that population, and if a given population is overpopulation, it tends to have higher environmental resistance that then brings it back to the carrying capacity. Likewise, following a fire or other form of natural disturbance, there's a natural succession or change over time. This is called secondary succession. Following a fire, annual plants or weeds might come in first, then perennial plants and grasses, then shrubs might take a few years to germinate and thrive, then the fast-growing trees like the pine trees, the softwoods. And then maybe 60, 80, 100, 150 years later, you get dominance by the hardwood trees. And even once you reach that, quote, climax community, it then could fluctuate over time. And one species might become more abundant or less abundant, just depending on internal dynamics. Now, I want to also look at a systems approach to ecology and environmental studies, because really to understand how the system works and to manage it well, we have to understand the factors that are controlling the whole systems. And so some of these large-scale ecosystem manipulations have lended a lot of insight. Late 50s, early 1960s, we didn't know why some lakes had overabundance of algae growth and others did not. And there were a number of scientists investigating what were called limiting factors. What was the factor that limited population growth? Is it phosphorus? Is it nitrogen? Is it carbon? Is it something else? And so in this area of Canada, the experimental lake area of Canada, there's so many lakes, they number them instead of naming these lakes. Dave Schindler and his colleagues did some studies on Lake 226, which is kind of shaped like a figure 8. And as you can see in the middle here, the narrows, they basically blocked it off. So they took one lake that was kind of continually linked, blocked it off with a plastic barrier, floats were sewn into the top, weights were on the bottom, and then they sent divers down with sandbags to basically separate one side of the lake from the other side of the lake. And then this became a controlled experiment that you could manipulate. On the near side, they added carbon and nitrogen, and there was no change in the environment. Now, they had done some smaller scale laboratory studies and determined that probably phosphorus is the one that's regulating how much algae grows in this system. So to the other side, they added carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and they saw massive blooms of blue-green algae. You can even see this looking at the surface of the lake, just the blue-green scum that's covering the entire lake on that far side of the lake. And this was then enough to convince the Canadian government and many states within the United States that bordered the Great Lakes that we ought to pull phosphorus out of our laundry detergents. And so if you look at the back of a bottle of laundry detergent, you'll see it says phosphate free. And that means it has only low levels of phosphorus, less than 0.5%. And this then is going to, it was an easy way to reduce phosphorus pollution and eutrophication of our waterways. Another case of kind of a systems approach is investigations of Georgia salt marshes. This was done by Teal and colleagues and reported in this textbook that I've used for another class. And they basically measured how much plant growth is there and then how much animal growth is there based on that plant growth. So they found that out of the possible sunlight, a small fraction of it was actually captured by the plants, Spartina grasses and algae, and this is known as GPP, or gross primary production, the total amount of photosynthesis in the marsh. But then the plants have to burn some of these calories in order to stay alive. They have to take some of the sugars that they've photosynthesized and then burn those sugars in order to meet their metabolic needs, to grow new cells, to excrete salts from that area so they don't get too salty. And then the net total growth is only 34,000 units as opposed to 152,000 for gross primary production. And the difference is that net, that respiration, which you see at the bottom, the arrow pointing down, the green arrow pointing down, which is 118,000 units. So after you take that away, that respiration cost, you end up with net primary production. And the easy way to remember which one's gross and which one's net is it works like your paycheck. Your gross paycheck is always larger, your net paycheck is smaller. And what's the difference between those? Taxes. You have to take out taxes and Social Security, and then you're left with your net pay, which is your take-home pay. So the total amount of growth of plants is the net primary production. The difference is 118,000 in this case, respiration, the quote taxes you have to pay to stay alive. Now from here, Teal and colleagues basically looked, where does that energy go? Captured by the sun, by the plants, available to the animals in the system and the bacteria in the system. Now you might think, okay, it's going to be eaten by grazers and goes up the food chain, but the grazer food chain actually is a much smaller arrow. A much smaller fraction of that energy ends up going to insects and then to spiders, etc. The vast majority of it goes to the detritus food chain, dead, decaying organisms, dead plant material, then broken down by bacteria, broken down by nematodes, eaten by crabs, eaten by mud snails, things like that. And then ultimately, with the flowing in and out of the tides, some of it gets exported. About half of the net primary production ultimately leaves the salt marsh through tidal export. And so this was a study that kind of looked at the whole system to understand the energy flow of that system and how important each of these parts are. Hansen et al. Looked at precipitation in a forest plot at Oak Ridge National Lab to understand the predictions of climate change. So climate change is not just global warming, but it also means that in some areas they're going to become more rainy. Some areas might experience greater drought following a warming of the climate. And it's going to affect seasonality, it's going to affect a lot of different aspects. And so they wanted to study, well, what happens if climate changes and then an area gets more rainfall than it did in the past, or it got less. And they created these troughs that covered about a third of the area, and then basically captured that rainfall and exported it from the dry plots into the wet plots. So the dry plots had 33% less rainfall that ended up making its way into the soil. and then that excess was dumped into the wet plots. So they had 133% of the normal rainfall to simulate, well, what happens if there's extra precipitation? And then you have the ambient area that's a control, and they studied this for several years in order to gain some insight to study the whole system and manipulate the whole system, not just break it down to one species in a lab, and that study is useful enough. So in conclusion, we looked at the tragedy of the commons, different worldviews, the dynamic nature of environmental systems, and a systems approach to ecology. Now, as we examine our case, I want you to look at stakeholders. The other thing I'm going to have you do is contemplate this concept of the last child in the woods. So as a part of your readings, I've assigned just the introductory section from The Last Child in the Woods. It's a great book by Richard Louv. I would strongly encourage you to read it, but it goes beyond the scope of this course. Basically, what he argues in this book is that the present generation of college students, really 15 years ago, he was arguing they were the last ones that had a true experience with the natural systems, because there are things in our modern world that keep us disconnected from that, whether it's cell phones, whether it's cable television, whether it's computers. People want to spend more time indoors, not interacting with their native ecosystems. And so he argued that people are going to stop caring about the natural world and saving it. So what I want you to do as a part of your discussion this week is I want you to think about your connections. What are the ways that I'm connected to the natural world? And I want you to, throughout this course, then kind of revisit it. What are some ways that I can reinforce my connection to the natural world? Maybe it's planting a garden. Maybe it's taking more walks in the woods. Maybe it's taking your dog for a walk along the marsh in your neighborhood. Maybe it's going bird watching, but deliberate ways that you can connect yourself with the ecosystems of the world to reinforce that connection. Thanks.